All right. So this is our season 2, episode 2 of the Shadow Dragon podcast. This is Daniel Clemens, founder and CEO of Shadow Dragon. I'll let you guys give your intros really quick before we kick it off for the day.
I'm Elliott. I'm Elliott Anderson. I work with Daniel at Shadow Dragon. I'm the CTO. I bet you guys know Nico, but he can introduce himself. So,
hi, Nico Dekens. Some people know me better by my handle, that's OSINT guy, and I'm now officially part of Shadow Dragon as well. I am the director of intelligence and innovation collection. So, we're pretty proud to join you guys.
Yeah, it's good to have you. It's good to have you, Nico. It's been fun the last few months for sure.
Yeah, I know one of the few guys who's pulled me out of the cave over the years has been Nico. So, thank you.
Well, I'm glad to have that honor.
Yes. So today, in our podcast, we've got a few different topics at hand. We're going to try to go over all these in a short amount of time to keep this lively. But we've got the uprise of lone wolf attacks by the Islamic State out of Europe. We've got tyranny against farmers, pretty much all over the place. We've got data dumps and irregular warfare observed in Ukraine, Russia, and all over Europe. We've got spies caught, particularly many different connections to Brazil and a few other countries. Scalable human trafficking workflows for those that might want to be illuminated on that. The ever new balloon spy scandal, or Chinese spy balloon flying all over the place, and now everyone and their mom is monitoring the skies from their home. API collection, data scraping, etc. The state of the industry, and then we've got a recontinuation of the discussion on the splintering of different social media platforms and discussion forums. Where this is going, what's going on, and then finally a small little snippet on once again data telling the story, why that's important from an analyst perspective. Whether you've got tools or you don't have tools, the data is always going to tell the story. So, without further ado, Nico, I'm gonna hand the ball off to you on the uprise of lone wolf attacks that have been observed in Europe. By the Islamic State, and maybe you can give us some historical context on what you've seen in the past, what you're seeing right now, and what people can collect on, think about, and be aware of.
Yeah, sure. So historically seen, I think we had a bunch of huge attacks in France and Belgium around 2015-ish. Where we had a couple of terrorist cells that had ties with the Netherlands and a lot of other European countries, but they were all based upon, let's say, a handful of fighters that went to Syria and joined that holy fight. So at that moment in time, I was investigating that stuff within the Dutch government and keeping tracks on that and working closely with other law enforcement agencies within Europe and all around the world. And somehow it stopped all of a sudden. And that is what got me worried, because terrorist cells, particularly jihadi terrorists, they don't stop. That's just simply how terrorist cells work. But particularly when we look at the Islamic State, they are in it for the long run. They have a very long breath when it comes to planning an attack or taking the time to set up a cell and work with that. It can take literally decades to execute a certain plan. With that, of course, the Islamic State was somewhat stopped in that region in Syria, particularly with help of the United States. But since they left there, and most people left, the problem started to rise again. Interestingly, their online presence really slowed down. So they had a very long and good online presence on Facebook and on Telegram. But I think it's safe to say that the last 5 years, compared to the years before, there was little to no online presence by Islamic State jihadis or propaganda or similar stuff like that. Now, the last 2 months, we've had several knife attacks on public places. So think of airports, train stations, shopping malls. And most of them were claimed by individuals that claimed to be part of the Islamic State. And their modus operandi was exactly the same: maximum damage with a knife, and then killed by cop. That's basically what their goal is. Now, luckily, those people were just arrested, so not killed, because, well, I think it's safe to say that compared to the United States and the EU, cops don't shoot as quick as they do in the United States due to all kinds of regulations and laws. So with it, I'm hoping that in time we will get more insight on if these were orchestrated or coordinated attacks. But knowing what I know, because I've worked for almost 15 years in counterterrorism units, that most of these attacks are carefully orchestrated, where they are particularly using social media to trigger lone wolves. So
Yeah.
lone wolves being people that are already interested in the subject matter. And if you, coming back to the previous podcast, pinch them enough to get their attention, they may do something on, let's say, the bigger holy good on their behalf. So the actual cell, the terrorist cell that's orchestrating it, stays out of sight. And you have just that one little dumb person that's on their attic streaming the internet the entire time, or scraping the internet, and now it's like, hey, let me go to action. But it's getting disturbing because it's again in public places where we have seen a couple of very horrific incidents. Last week, one in Brussels; the week before, one in the France train station. And those are places that I roam very often when I travel. And those are
Yeah.
places where people are super off guard, and it's super easy to attack people. So with that, I was anticipating on security to go up, but so far I haven't seen any visible security go up in those public places. And that by itself, I think, is somewhat concerning, because I anticipate, looking at what I can see with my fake identities or personas or virtual agents, whatever you like to call them, I can see that there is more activity than the last 5 years. So there's clearly something going on, but I haven't yet, let's say, put my finger on the spot what's exactly going on.
Yeah, that's interesting because, in the US, we have had, a plethora of active shooter situations, and it does kind of seem like some of the same kind of TTP as, you have a lone wolf attack, you have some weapon of choice, you have an area that's chosen that's going to have, low security, aka gun-free zones where no one can shoot back. And I wonder if there's any kind of correlation there between the psychology of some of those attackers, if it's, just the lone wolf guy that wants to be famous, or is mentally ill, or if it is correlated to something that's a deeper ideology, right?
Yeah, I think when it comes to that with the comment that you made, the lone guy or girl that wants to be famous, so far I haven't seen any manifestos. That's what you normally see with those people. So for me, that makes me feel somewhat confident to say that they are just doing these attacks in part of being, let's say, what they think a greater good, and not necessarily them trying to heroify themselves.
But do you think that it's a part of a larger campaign to embolden more radical behavior in Europe within the extreme Islamic communities to kind of recruit, or is it just maybe the negative sentiment of being displaced and all the weirdness there in a new place? What do we know about any of the attackers themselves, on their patterns of life, personal profiles, or anything like that?
So far, what I've been able to find out is that most of them are trying to belong to something, and in this case, they're trying to belong to Islamic State orientated thought goods. And of course, when you look at the overall agenda when it comes to the Islamic State, they're their methods were always trying to have those scare tactics. So with having a stabbing incident, it simply shows, hey, we're still present in your area and we can do whatever we want when we want. And that scares people. And that also makes maybe some people choose sides. So maybe if some people think, if I can't beat him, then maybe join him because I want to stay safe. Those are common tactics being used within those groups.
You know, Nico, I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I wonder if the destabilization of Afghanistan could be helping fuel some of this, as you know, there's obviously more freedom there for them to kind of operate how they want, especially the extremists.
Yeah.
Maybe it's indirectly or directly affecting it. I'm not an expert, but when I look at the major changes in the world, you have Syria and you have Afghanistan as two major changes over the last 6-8 years.
Yeah.
So that could be an effect possibly.
Well, but also keep in mind that the last 2 years, a lot of countries within Europe, and I don't know how that happened in the US, so people who went to Syria, so the locals from here, so typical Dutch guys and girls who went to Syria and joined that holy fight of the Islamic State, now are being actively brought back by, for example, the Dutch government. So you have people that spent like almost a decade there being indoctrinated, even having children there, and they are now actively being brought back to the Netherlands.
No,
And,
why are they
well,
why are they being brought back?
to convict him over here, but what could possibly go wrong with people that you bring back over here? Because not all of them will be jailed. They will basically bring them back because they think they are still Dutch citizens and they have a Dutch passport, for example. But Belgium and Germany, they do the same thing.
Yeah, and unlike the US, you guys are a little more the sentences are short. So even if they are guilty, they're gonna be out.
So what could
Well,
possibly go wrong?
you guys also don't have Guantanamo and a strange process there, and possibly
I don't know if that's the poster child for for the process, but
and this is why you need Guantanamo for 500, Alex. No, just kidding. Well, that's interesting though. I mean, definitely there's a lot of stuff going on. As far as violence, you have this, you have strange acts of sabotage all over the place, almost everywhere. The velocity of information that's coming out pretty much everywhere, almost for any topic you want to monitor, the velocity is just moving so fast. It almost feels like we're moving at like 10 to 15 years every 1 to 2 weeks as far as the velocity has been going, and that's been going since COVID. So it's definitely strange.
COVID made people angry. COVID made people angry, period.
Oh, I think so.
People who were not, let's say, angry with government or any regulations before, now are way more angry. So I think things can go sideways way quicker compared to pre-COVID, because people are now just, they're not putting up with that crap anymore. They're like, hey, we did, for example, in Europe, we didn't see real demonstrations and rallies for decades. The last ones were in the 80s, wherein people were doing those anti-nuclear stuff demonstrations. And now during COVID and after COVID, all of a sudden, people are willing to go physically on the streets again. And that by itself shows something. But also, this, just like you said, we see that scatter within the tools that we built with Shadow Dragon. We see that scatter all the time, that there is so much activity going on. People are ready to take action, period.
Yeah, I don't know if it's ready to take action. I think it's just possibly just standing up and saying, look, some of this bullshit is so hardcore from a government perspective. From an individual, that may not fit into a binary pattern of, get the vax, don't get the vax, you're in society, you're out of society. A lot of people are just saying, look, like, you're not giving me any level of security in what the unintended side effects of this might be. I may not want to do it, or I may not fit into the pattern of needing it, yet it's pushed upon them. And I think a lot of people just don't like to be dictated to. This is I don't think there's any surprise for me that people are standing up against being told what to do, because for the last, 100+ years, everybody, Europe and America combined have really been pushing this idea of, a society that has some level of representation, not dictator-based rules, So I was surprised that more people didn't stand up earlier against all of this, just because some of it just seemed so ridiculous, like poor planning with unknown unintended consequences everywhere, even if we just look at our own business and business life in general,
Yeah, I think it took a little time because initially people didn't have that socioeconomic uncertainty, and the last 2 to 2.5 years, a lot of people got way poorer than they were before, and that makes people want to stand up, which makes perfect sense.
And I think
and it gives time.
Yeah.
Sorry, give some time on their hands too. I mean,
yeah,
right. True. You can only watch so much Netflix, right? But I think it's going to get worse, though. Sadly, like you look at the financial, headwinds. There is a lot of money moving around. Some portions of the market are really hot, and then other areas, the cost of inflation to most people is pretty hardcore right now, and I think it's going to get worse as the Fed continues to tighten their cycles, and everyone
interesting times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that this kind of leads into our the next topic at hand, which is tyranny against farmers, where farmers are gonna, farmers don't like being told what to do. They don't like to be in the city. They like to have some isolation, some peace of mind, and farmers are rising up against whatever the new regulations of the day by elected or unelected officials may be. Elliott, Nico, what do you guys got on this topic? What's going on?
Well, I imagine Nico's probably been stuck in a traffic jam or two because of this. They certainly like pushing hay bales on the road over there.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm looking at it from a perspective of not being in the EU, but just kind of watching it from afar. I think if your goal is to crack down, like I think it was nitrogen they're upset about, the EU is, but it's like if you're going to crack down on something like that, just saying, hey, next year you got to be 70% down, or I don't remember the number exactly, but it's this huge cut. Like, how in the world would they expect somebody who has been running these farms for hundreds of years and their families to just go, oh yeah, we'll just go out of business? So the behavior is not surprising at all that they're acting that way. But I'm sure you might have a little more insight in that stuff than I do.
Yeah, well, it's mostly about the emission stuff and the nitrogen stuff, where basically they want to steal their land. There's no other way how I could put it, because they're saying, hey, the Netherlands, we have, and that's fair to say, compared to all the other countries within Europe, we have a very high density. We are a very small country when it comes to miles and square kilometers. So we have a lot of farmers that they generate a lot of that emission compared to the rest of Europe. But you cannot expect them to, just like you said, to stop their business just overnight. So, and a lot of these farmers are very willing to think out a plan, a longer term plan, saying, "Hey,
right, yeah,
this is
that's what I was getting at.
This is how we can make this work together with you, the government or the governments." But interestingly, so far it hasn't been going that well, and they basically go to the streets. So they block roads, they go to politicians, their homes, and make their point. And well, they get a little bit aggressive now and then, which makes sense, because if I had my family with a farm, which we had for over 150 years, and now you're telling me that by the end of May we need to either sell our land or do something that will cost us so much money that will put us out of business, I'd be angry too. Doesn't mean that I support violence in general, but it makes sense, right?
But it's almost kind of like how the United States was started.
Tell me more. So I clearly didn't have my history lessons.
Well, you had the British.
It was a 3% tea tax.
Yeah, they increased a tax on tea, right? And there were other issues going on between citizens within the United States area and the Brits, and eventually they felt like they didn't have any representation for with the government, and it was just being pushed down their throats. And eventually that's where we had our Constitution written up in our Bill of Rights, where there's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And I'm botching it right now because I don't have it in front of me, but this is when anytime you mess with people's money and you mess with their kids, and then I'd say the last one would be their land or their castle. Yeah. Human response is gonna be pissed off, right? And the farmers, like, it's not just about producing food and having a livelihood. It's also about the relationship with the animals and the way of life that it's like there's a switch getting turned on and off, and someone is saying, oh, this is now bad because of whatever emissions or whatever idea that they think it is, that makes it a critical moment. It's I think from the farmer's perspective, they're like, look, this doesn't seem to add up. We don't need to have crazy PhD status and know everything about climate and the changing of the earth to know that farming is pretty basic. Let's keep it simple.
Yeah. No, but honestly, when I look at some interviews I see on Dutch TV or in media, there are some PhD farmers over here that clearly know how this stuff works, and they clearly also now can show that the plans that the government showed will not work and will never work. But interestingly, it's not only my country. I've noticed that recently, for example, in the areas of around Pakistan, so the larger cities over there, they have farmers protesting because they are not being paid well. They're not being taken care of properly, or they cannot sell their milk and eggs for the right price anymore because government set up new tax rules and that kind of stuff. So there's slowly, again, starting to grow a trend on a global scale when it comes to farming in general, where, well, for example, when we talk about the prices of a box of eggs, so 12 eggs in the box, it's now 4 times worth the money compared to last year. And no one exactly knows why. It just happened almost overnight.
I have chickens in my backyard, Nico, so I certainly have no idea what.
No, yeah. That's I think that's also a problem. What we see within a lot of places in Europe is that we have such high numbers of people living in a very small amount of square miles. So I can, for example, I cannot have chickens in my backyard. My backyard is too small for that. I can't grow my own greens or something like that. So with that, we are reliant on, let's say, farmers. But if the farmers, their land is taken away or the prices are going up so high, it will make it nearly impossible to do business.
Once again, let's blame centralized planning for the lack of forethought on any urban and regional planning, where there's going to be unintended consequences, right? So I mean, we've got the same thing in the United States, but for different problem sets. Some of the chicken stuff, that's definitely, I've heard that. We were talking about that earlier this morning, me and Elliott and a few groups of friends on text, where there are some interesting things, but also some of the other areas of bad centralized planning within suburban communities across the southwest and different parts of the United States is how they handle water, right? And how they're places are saying, hey, we're gonna start this new community. Obviously we need water and utilities for the community, we're gonna tap in a 1,200-foot well, and then boom, water tables in a whole region are lowered, and now you have possibly the set that impacting places like Lake Mead and other places in larger areas where someone is making a decision for a small community, not thinking about the larger impact.
But
Yeah,
I still think it's fun to monitor these subject matter, because you see that waterbed effect happening.
It's pretty obvious, especially with what's going on in the Netherlands and the EU with the nitrogen and that stuff. Is depending on where you land on the argument as to whether or not it's good or bad, kind of is irrelevant, because even if you say, oh, it's terrible, we need to curb it, saying, hey, just arbitrarily you have to cut this off at this massive percentage, that's that lack of planning, and that's going to upset people.
And discussion also is around biodiversity and that kind of stuff. And the farmers are like, yeah, hey, we can make our land have little flowers in the grass again, because we now don't have it anymore, because it's more efficient to produce milk or something like that. But it will not be cost effective. So either the government needs to jump in on that part, or we need to figure out an alternative way to do that. We are more than willing to change those things, but it's not just something that we need to figure out on our own.
Right. And that's kind of where I was going with that. This just sounds very heavy handed, and just there wasn't a lot of thought put into it. I mean, you look at, this is not a perfect parallel, but in the United States, we switched off analog television to digital in like the early 2000s. They spent 12 years trying to get everybody ready for that. It was so that, because it was a big change, and they spent 12 years doing that. And then you take something like someone's livelihood on a farm and you go, hey, you can't do this anymore. They're going to be mad. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Although I do find it kind of funny. They protest on the roads better than we do. Our guys run out and stand in the street. They just put hay bales. I think that's smarter.
Yeah. And of course those farming tractors. There's no way for Dutch law enforcement, those little Volkswagen cars, to get those things out of the way, right?
Yeah, you're basically gonna have to get a semi truck, tow truck, to pull something like that out of the way. I mean, we saw in Canada when the truckers did that, they realized how incredibly helpless they. That was.
So they now rented like Caterpillars and that kind of stuff, just to be a little bit prepared, just in case. It's funny.
There's and by the way, what is going on in Canada with all that? It kind of like it peaked last February, March, and then what happened?
That had a waterbed effect to France and the Netherlands again. So those truckers protesting. So we had literally the phenomenons called convoys. So convoys of truckers and let's say trucker related people just creating traffic jams all over Europe, just because it has mostly supply chain kind of demonstrations.
In Canada, a lot of it was they were telling them they had to get vaccinated and they couldn't cross the border if they weren't, and they didn't want to. And if you think about the type of person that drives a semi truck across the tundra in Canada, that's not the type of person that you're going to convince easily of anything, really. And so if they said, hey, we're going to take your livelihood away, you can't do this anymore, what did you expect them to do? Yeah. What did Trudeau and those guys expect? I mean, where you land on the argument for yes or no, kind of irrelevant. You just took the guy's job away. How's he going to act?
Right. Right. And if the goal is to control the populace, right, what works better, pleasure or control? What have we learned over the last 200 plus years of just 200 years? One works, one kind of works, but one definitely doesn't work.
Yeah, and interesting, due to COVID, we will see that people are willing to team up with truckers. For example, the Yellow Vests immediately teamed up. Extinction Rebellion immediately teamed up. So all those groups are now friends. So they used to be frenemies, let's say, a little bit more, and now they really team. We see outlaw motorcycle gangs team up with people that are, let's say, pro farmer, and I've seen mixes that I was like 10 years ago that would be impossible.
Yeah. But I mean, the common thing here is individual rights and don't tread on me, man.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so that's an interesting kind of thread to pull on if we're wondering, where is all this going? Is this a new revolution of individual rights moving forward in the future? And and hopefully bad politicians will take a back seat and maybe have kids in Europe.
Yeah, who knows?
But I don't
Yeah,
know.
but do not underestimate influence campaigns, because if I was a certain nation state, I would also use and abuse these things. So farmer protests, trucker protests, Extinction Rebellion, and plant my little seeds in those echo chambers, because then all I need to do is sit back and relax, and they do the work for me. And that's something that I'm clearly noticing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wonder how much information until everybody just turns it off and says, I don't care about anything. I don't care about social media. I don't care about the news. I want my eggs.
Yeah. I think, Nico, I think I think that's common. I mean, when we saw back in the 2016 thing where everybody was upset about Russian influence on Facebook, if you look at the actual ads they didn't just pick one side. They picked different, they pushed green energy stuff. They pushed sort of like right leaning sort of ideology as well as left leaning ideology. I mean,
it's all about disrupting society, right? That's
creating division.
I agree.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think that is the case. I'm not gonna say I was surprised when I saw that stuff from the Russian things, but it was, I mean, we're going pretty far back in time before anyone even really took the internet all that serious when it came to sort of geopolitics. Now, me and you and Dan, I mean, this is the industry we've been in forever, so we obviously could see that, but the world generally couldn't. So it was obvious Russia and China and nation state various nation state actors.
I gotta admit though, I was still very surprised at the impact of the DNC leaks, regardless of who's behind it. I wasn't paying attention to what they were until like probably a week into it. I'm like, golly, I'm gonna have to go read these emails. It sounds kind of cringy. This sounds kind of BS to me. And then when I started reading the emails, I was like, whoa, like John Podesta is a weird dude. This is super weird. Like, I never heard of any of this stuff. And I think whoever else read the same thing thought, that's kind of weird. That's too weird. I don't understand it. There's no frame of reference in a normal person's life. And from a voting perspective, the middle part of America is what's going to be ringing that bell. I think a lot of people are like, that's weird.
Yeah, and I think that's also spot on, because the vast majority of people will never spot these things, because it's not in their daily life. It's not what they need to pay attention to. They should be paying attention to these things happening, but you can't expect it from that, because their life is just doing your 9-to-5 job, raising your kids, and those outside influences not necessarily trigger you on saying, hey, maybe there's a bigger picture trying to influence me or something like that.
Right. And I think people are waking up to that, but I think, and this is kind of going into our next topic of data dumps and irregular warfare. What does irregular warfare look like? What does the asymmetrical warfare look like in light of social media, all these channels to push information, as well as a tool for warfare in a time of change that could be political change, or it could be something similar to the Ukraine and Russia conflict. And I've really been thinking about this a lot. I'd love to hear y'all's perspective on it, but kind of a lot of people are asking, like, when I'm talking about this recently, is like, well, what is asymmetrical warfare? What is irregular warfare? And I'll just break it down to a few things from my perspective, having a past doing computer exploitation, vulnerability discovery, exploit development, all that kind of stuff. There's different puzzle pieces out there in the world. And let's take Russia, for example. They've got, they've got a military, they've got logistics in that military, yet they also have an infrastructure and an economy with all these digital assets that rely on computers, right? And with computers, the computer exploitation process makes certain attacks very advantageous to a much smaller select group of attackers to tilt the scales in their favor for an outcome. And what does that look like? So like, let's say I want to go take apart an application, right? I'll spend a lot of time reverse engineering it. I'll document every vulnerability or problem that I may see, along the way. But I'm really kind of taking all this time to familiarize myself with an application and the systems around that application to discern vulnerability classes that are, low risk, medium risk, high risk, and critical risk vulnerabilities. And as we know with computer systems, we've got read access, write access, execution access, and a lot of times when you need to put together an exploit, you're not going to get auto execution anymore because that's super hard. Much like, we're not going to be able to tilt the scales to change a country to be a, something with, elected officials and true representation and democracy overnight. We know that's also not going to happen sometimes for 50 or 60 years, right? So back to the computer exploitation, hacker math is where some of this comes into play, where if I can find low risk vulnerabilities, 2 or 3 low risk vulnerabilities, one might be read access, one might be write access, and the other might enable some execution access. I can tie those things together from a computer perspective, and I can, turn these few low risk vulnerabilities in an application into one super critical vulnerability that I can exploit, right? And how that kind of methodology, I call it hacker math. 1 + 1 does not equal 2. 1 + 1 can equal 7. And now it's a critical vulnerability that can get exploited. That kind of methodology is being played out in front of us with data dumps, with systems being compromised, and then open source intelligence overlaid on top of whatever the data points are in each computer compromise that's leaked out, to enable, full attribution on folks that may have been, super spies for a long time, or may have been working with another country and nobody knew about it. And that paints us a picture of, oh, look at these foreign policy connections that we didn't know about before. What are they talking about? The overlay of computer exploitation and open source intelligence creates this cool vacuum of irregular warfare that's being exploited in front of us in a way that I don't think we've seen ever, which is really exciting. And I am going to go out on a limb to say, I think that what we're watching with Russia is really very similar to the Berlin Wall coming down, with some of these, systems being exploited, some of the data that's coming out, how that data can be pivoted on, either with tools or manually, and what additional color it brings to the global landscape for irregular warfare, right? As I think this is what World War III is looking like. This is the tip of the spear. And that's my intro for the data dumps and the irregular warfare, right? And now, can you guys take the ball on a few of the data dumps that are kind of resonating and showing up in different places right now?
Yeah, I found it particularly interesting to find to have that recent Yandex leak. How basically their GitHub repositories were leaked to the internet, and that showed clearly how their algorithms worked. And there needs to be a lot of analysis still about those documents. I went through them to some extent, But also, I simply need help because there's some language in there and some language difficulties in there. Also, from a developer's programming perspective, that I cannot always immediately comprehend. But for
Mhm.
me, it's interesting to learn about how they try to stem results or how they like to filter out certain results when you use their system. And alternatively, we see a similar dump that you posted about the Russian Snowden version, if you may say so. You had a good word for it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, the Snowdenized. I called it the Snowdenized dump.
Yeah.
Basically surveillance capabilities within Russia on their citizens that actually are outside of the bounds of their air quotes legal framework, if there is a legal framework in Russia for lawful intercept and surveillance. That's what that dump was about.
Yeah,
I think
but not only it's not only Russia orientated, because we've seen that big Twitter leak recently.
Yeah.
We've seen other huge leaks. We've seen large, let's say, cyber company leaks that provide certain solutions. That their data sets being leaked, and that by itself is all part of what you say, that asymmetric warfare. They're trying to disrupt. Recently, we had Killnet, the APT group, announcing that they will attack hospitals worldwide. And that by itself is pretty smart, because maybe they are already in those systems. And if you're going to announce it, then maybe you will see hospitals take countermeasures. So that will give you more vision. But otherwise, if you're going to announce it, you will also see that people might come after you. So you will see that you will now have red teams and all kind of hunting groups be going after Killnet. So I think from the people who are behind Killnet, it's a very smart move, because either way they triggered action just by announcing something online.
Right. And you're also seeing the ransomware ecosystem start to incorporate public relations.
Yep.
It's crazy. It's so
people
crazy,
for hire. They
right?
give you vacation days, holidays, all kinds of stuff. I if you would ask me this 15 years ago, would you let's see official job openings for APTs somewhere posted online, clearly visible, so you don't even have to, let's say, go into the deep or dark web and in some obscure place. No, it's just out in the open. Hey, want to work for this APT? Here's the link where you can apply. It's
Right.
crazy.
Right. Yeah. And kind of getting on a small rant, we are now in kind of the non-disclosure phase of exploit disclosure, many years after that debate started in early 2000s. And the 0-day scene is booming.
Yeah.
So
it's business.
It's
like big business.
I was listening to a friend. He's talking about, some of the buys that they're doing on phone stuff. And I mean, pretty much everything's owned all the time.
Yeah.
You didn't have that 15 years ago, at least to the extent that it is now. It's crazy.
I spotted recently something owned my thermostat. I was looking at the network logging, and it started talking to something in China.
Fun.
Just out of the blue. Just so he doesn't get on the internet anymore. That device doesn't.
Yeah, but that by itself, that comment, it doesn't get on the internet anymore. But we are at a stage that we buy devices that by default will go. I recently bought a toothbrush, an electrical toothbrush, and and it had Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connectivity. I'm like, it's a damn toothbrush. Why should it connect to anything? It should just
bought a fridge. I just brought a fridge that's got Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on it.
Yeah, it's crazy. Why we're doing it ourselves? We're doing this to ourselves when it comes to being vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So kind of backing back into the comments on the Yandex leak. Some of our listeners may or may not know what kind of the impact there is. Just for context, Yandex is the Google of Russia on steroids.
It's pretty effective too. I mean, it works well. Like
their algorithms
super good. Yeah.
They're
finding
AI,
faces.
Yep.
Yeah,
finding faces. True
it's image
scalable NLP. Hey, anybody who wants to do some real NLP in multiple languages, just look at their code base. I'm sure it has a bunch of great stuff.
We also had the Twitter leak was really exciting. I know we went through some of the data, and it looks like that leak was a situation where it wasn't so much of a leak as like a scrape using a sort of a hack in the API. What's interesting though, from what I was reading, and this is just kind of internet hearsay, it looks like Twitter knew about this for a long time and didn't fix it. And so
now, which leak is this though? Because there were 3 incidents within a very short amount of time. Some of them one of them looked like a compromise. One of them looked like just normal data scrape. And then
it's the data scrape one. I'd have to pull it up and see exactly. But what was interesting about that though, was it gave us emails and a lot of really good information on Twitter users. And that's really helpful to identify who's running multiple accounts. I think that was one of the really powerful aspects of the Twitter leak. Like, if you go look, I have a few sock puppets that I use in certain areas, and those are linked to emails that are just random stuff. But I have some that are just all linked to the same email. I've got, so if you go in the breach and you can see that, you can see, oh, these 3 accounts are controlled by me. So that's one of the most interesting things that came out of that Twitter dump. There's also floating around the no-fly list that was I believe
an interesting one.
Wasn't it just an open file on a server for
it was just a misconfigured little thingy. Yeah, someone forgot to pull the switch.
Yeah, so I think that'd be, from a nation state perspective, that'd be a very interesting list to look at. If I'm a Dutch, why would there be a Dutch person on there or something like that? So I don't know the ins and outs of how they communicate that back and forth. I know there's a little bit of communication between EU and US or I guess the Five Eye countries on that kind of thing, but certainly seeing that list from a nation state perspective is going to be really interesting for certain groups. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I think when it comes to any leaks and breaches recently, it's just the amount of stuff that people share online. That's just also so worrying. People share so much details. It's but also when you sign up for a flashlight app on the Android store or the Apple store, why do you need to share your camera roll? Why do you need to share your contact list? Why do you need to provide your credit card number? It's just a flashlight app, for example. It's just people don't ask questions. People don't doubt the stuff that they use.
I don't know if it's that or they don't know how to engage in conflict properly, right? Like, just say no. That's one way to do it. And then there's no avenue in some of these apps to say, voice your concerns or even have a true public discussion or dialogue. It's just take it or leave it across the board, and there's no place to voice that.
Yeah, same counts. For example, the TikTok example that popped up recently, where people in China had certain, let's say, anti-government pictures on their phone, and TikTok was able to delete those pictures from their camera roll. So that by itself,
I hadn't heard that.
It's pretty interesting.
That's weird.
So there were certain individuals that were using TikTok that had, let's say, anti-Chinese government information in the form of photos or videos.
A picture of Winnie the Pooh.
And this mysteriously disappeared from their phone. And that by itself, again, shows that everything that's for free, you are the product, and they basically own you.
Yeah, that is something that if people ask me a lot about safety for kids and stuff, because my kid's online a lot, I don't know a lot, man, that's the first thing. If it's free, you're the product. The cow thinks the grass is free.
Yeah, and it also comes again to the discussion this week where Twitter announced that their API will no longer be for free. I just drink my coffee behind my computer and I laugh about the people that are like, it has to be free. It has been free for years. And I'm like, dude, you don't own the platform. You're just a guest there. and if someone else now owns that shop, they can do whatever with that shop that they want. And of course, in this case, Elon bought that platform for billions and billions of dollars. He
Right.
clearly showed people that it's not making it didn't make any money for the last 10 years, and he wants his money back. So he comes up with ways to
Well,
generate money.
I think there may be some really good outcomes from that, because let's not forget that Twitter didn't want to give a lot of commercial access to the data. They wanted to have like this super fire hose where you pay like lots and lots of money, and then you can't really share the information. You can't commoditize it most of the time.
Yeah, there was the GNIP
Oh,
one, right?
right,
No one
right.
could access
Yeah,
it.
and we talked to those guys for a good bit. And if you got into that program, right, you were in. But it was a lot of money, and they would do some pretty good technical requirements for joining. But really, it was very exclusive access and limited access, and it costs a lot of money. And then on the flip side, you had this really neutered API that didn't really give you that much information. And opening up the free market to this a little bit, hey, maybe that can change things a little bit, where if you can pay a reasonable price for some of the data that you need, that may open up the collection universe a little bit better, and people have better insights, and maybe businesses will want to use it as well for pushing marketing campaigns. Like, we never wanted to use Twitter for pushing marketing campaigns, just because there was so much bias for a while. We didn't know what the real ROI was, because they couldn't articulate it from a business perspective. It was just like, we're great, we're awesome, you should do it. And it's like, well, how directed can this get, or how helpful can this get? I think Twitter being changed a good bit is probably going to be a good thing, and people are going to screech about what they can collect or what they can't collect, because they can't write good collectors. But whatever.
It's just funny to see that people are being pulled out of their comfort zone from a certain platform, and now they need to do or adjust, and adjusting is hard for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to a little bit about what we talked in the last episode, just about the splintering of the internet. There's, we saw back in like 2016 to around 2020, somewhere in there, we saw a pretty massive exodus from YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and places like that, of some more right-leaning groups. And they went out and created things like, just various, I won't name all the platforms. They created a bunch of different platforms, but a lot of them have died off. And then there's sort of like one or two that's come, they have like one or two that came up that are like the big ones now.
And Elliott, can you kind of refresh everybody, in case they weren't on the last episode, of kind of your thoughts on the splintering of the media and social media, where users are shifting, what they've done in the past, and where you think?
Yeah, sure. So generally speaking, what, going over the history of, just sort of the internet, or sort of the social aspects of the internet, not the tech necessarily, but we started in a very raw state. We started with IRC type things. We started with, Yahoo chats and games, and things became more and more polished. And you see that with Instagram now. Every picture on some of these accounts looks like some kind of amazing work of art. And what's happening is the kids, the parents are the ones on Instagram and things like that. And so they want something raw. So they're moving to things like Be Real and sort of raw sort of social media, a little more personal. Snapchat's an example of that to some extent. But there's also a fracturing of, we talked a little bit about it at the beginning, Nico, of just people getting more upset about things. And those groups have been splintering online. So in 2016, there was a lot of the whole Russian disinformation, face was messed with the elections and all this kind of stuff. And so all of a sudden you saw all the social media platforms actually start trying to adjust how they do things. They would, demonetize someone on YouTube, and that person would get upset and go to a new platform. And so that generally affected the more right-leaning groups at that point. But now that Elon bought Twitter, we're seeing the exact same pattern happen with the left as they're splintering out. They're firing up Mastodon servers all over the place and joining him. We've seen that. We actually have some pretty good tech to look at Mastodon in our Shadow Dragon systems. But what will happen is there'll be a lot of them. Then a few strong ones will survive. The rest will fall apart, and then people will go back to Twitter until we splinter again off of Twitter. And
Right.
so these ecosystems, from an open source intelligence perspective, are fantastic. The smaller a group is, the more they tend to trust each other, and the more extreme they tend to act. If you don't believe me, check out 4chan for 10 minutes. But the idea is that gives us insight into that world, and it also ties back to the asymmetrical warfare thing. I can do a lot more quote unquote damage in those small groups than I can being a fly in millions on Twitter.
And that also plays into kind of our targeting and attribution playbook, which is if we can get home court advantage, if you can change the field to a new field, you can put in the new rules, you can pinch folks, you can target them easier in a smaller spot, and you get better results, better return on investment on your attribution. And then it just kind of continues to happen,
Also, I think when you look at, we briefly touched upon this also in the previous episode, that you see that, let's say, almost every 7 to 10 years, when you see a generation change. So when people grow up, they have a need for newer platforms or let's say a newer perspective. This is when we see new apps pop up, or a different look and feel of apps. So sometimes more raw, sometimes more polished, sometimes more decentralized, sometimes more centralized. It's you can see that almost it's a cycle of every 7 to 10 years where you see that change overall, that overall behavior. It's so
Right.
simple. When people grow up, they become young adults to that kind of stuff.
Some of it's just, I don't want to do that because my parents do it, and it is not cool at all.
Exactly.
Right. But I mean, still pulling on that thread of, hey, there's a new platform, or this new platform enables XYZ. That does give us better opportunity, right? So like we started seeing this when Elliott and I were working on a lot of anti-human trafficking processes and curriculum and stuff like that. Once you got the girl or the pimp, the girl being the victim or the pimp, into a different scenario, we just had so much, or like a different platform or a different communication medium. We had so many different new avenues for attribution, because they just didn't have the time to do the OPSEC. They didn't have the time to think about what are the unintended consequences of being on this new platform. They just wanted to move their product or move their messaging as fast as possible. So I am kind of intentionally shifting the combo over to some of the anti-human trafficking stuff, but and I want to talk about a few different scalable workflows that we've had in the midst of getting access to a new playing field or a new platform. Elliott, I'll give you the mic in a second, but I'm going to talk about one very simple workflow for folks that are doing anti-human trafficking investigations, is looking at the phone number that's tied to an ad, right? Because the girl has to have the ad, or the pimp or the girl, and that phone number is usually controlled in some way by her handler or the trafficker. And the phone number is either going to, the carrier settings on that phone number, or the carrier attributes on that phone number or what can give us a really good insight into either this is a victim, or a human trafficking victim, or sex worker, right? And so looking at the carrier settings that are tied to the phone and the platform that the phone is on is very helpful. So what are the carrier settings? That would be, I would say, look for, is it a cell phone? Is it a data provider? Is it voice over IP? So typically the traffickers or the handlers are going to try to to treat these girls in a way that they can control their communication medium the most they possibly can. So the girl's going to be in a hotel with Wi-Fi, right? But a lot of the additional things that would come with that may not work. Like, you know, she may not have a cell phone, right? But she's got wireless access to communicate data. And the app that they're using typically, kind of, if you look at the carrier settings, it can tell us whether this is a VoIP app or tied to an actual application from the vendor. And then you start looking at that and you start seeing, hey, you know, like most, you know, a good more than 80% of the trafficking victims out there are in this scenario. So if you can just identify the carrier type and it's not a cell phone, 9 times out of 10, that's your, you know, prioritization that this is a victim versus a worker. Elliott, tell us about some of your workflows and other things that we've done.
When we talk about human trafficking, you definitely started on a point I really like: phone numbers. Even the smartest person is going to screw that up sometimes. So generally, what happens is you have the handler or the pimp. He's got his phone, and all of the ads for these girls online, they're going to come back to that phone or many phones. Now, if he's smart, he's going to have multiple numbers and things like that. The thing is, they don't get a new number every single time they post an ad or something like that. So they will screw up, or sometimes intentionally do it. Also, one thing that's kind of cool about the human trafficking crowd is they're not always the smartest. I mean, it's true of all sort of, you know, crime groups, but these guys, they tend to, that's an area they screw up. So you have the phone number, and then you also have the Venmos, the Cash Apps, the PayPals, that kind of stuff that are linked to the ads. And a lot of times what you'll see, it's a good indicator of a trafficking victim versus a sex worker, is you'll see maybe a Cash App that says, sexy Angela. And then but the girl's name in the ad is like, Patricia or something. And that's a good indicator that why would that be a different name? And that world, they do kind of go by different things and stuff, but that's an indicator. So then you start with like what Dan was talking about, where we take the phone number and we can see information about the phone, but the other things we can see connected to the phone number a lot of times are, what's the Cash App connected to it? What's the Skype connected to it? What else is here? Sometimes that can be a dead end, but even if it is a dead end, if we're seeing the same number across multiple ads, that still ties them together. So all we need is a data point across any of those ads to figure something out. So a good example of a data point like that would be, an alias for a PayPal or for a Cash App. And from there, a lot of times we can go from that alias and possibly find something else that's connected to. I've seen Duolingo many times connected, that people kind of just forget about that, I guess, and they're trying to learn a language or do something. And then that helps you start unraveling, who possibly is behind that. It's a relatively straightforward workflow. And then you get into the more nuanced approach of, like, if you've got hotel rooms, what do the hotel rooms look like? Are we, how do I differentiate between sort of just a sex worker and someone who's being trafficked? Things like, do you see a track mark on her back? Somebody who's a sex worker is not going to have a track mark in their back ever. And so there's little things like that you look for. And the accumulation of all of that information, it makes it much easier to piece together the network and who's behind it. And the more sophisticated ones have multiple layers too. You'll have handlers and you'll have people they report to. And that's where things get pretty interesting. But one of the things about that particular world is they have to sell their product online. And that gives us insights, from an OSINT perspective. Nico, I know you've worked on a lot of stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of workflow?
The things you already discussed, and the visual intelligence analysis is something that should never be underestimated. For example, in Europe, you see a lot of those sex workers and human traffic sex workers, their faces being blurred, but you will see the same lingerie, let's say, across multiple platforms in different language, in different countries, or they will use the same picture for their German advertisement as their, let's say Belgian advertisement. It's the same. So the visual intelligence is really important, but also just looking at, for example, a power outlet could tell you where the picture was originally taken, because power outlets all around the world may look different. Little niche things that could help you pivot, or different girls, same rooms, those kind of small little things.
I didn't mention that. That's a really good one right there. Yeah, you
Like,
see the
is
same
she-
room. It's
Is she taking the same? Is she taking the picture, or is someone else taking the picture? That's one of our rules for sure. And then the wallpaper. You know, what's the room look like? Does that give us, you know, a hotel brand, right?
And that's also interesting when it comes to, but this reminds me of the time when I did child abuse cases, so child pornography cases, where you would see that people were taking to hotels, young kids, but the carpeting of most hotels is unique per hotel or hotel chain, and that will help you at least narrow down where someone was at that moment in time.
Yeah. That's an excellent one, Nico. Some of the worst offenders I've ever heard of. I can think of two different cases where it was a bed, a sheet, a bed, like a comforter, and carpet. Those were the two things, and the visual aspect of that is incredibly important. If you can engage a target too, you can learn a lot through that as well. You know, and that's another thing about communicating with these people is you can, if you have the ability to communicate with them, depending on your role, you know, whether law enforcement or what, there's a variety of techniques we can use to, you know, identify information, maybe an IP, maybe a cell tower, maybe a lat long, things like that, by just talking a little bit with them. So
one funny thing that comes to mind immediately is that at a moment in time when I did these cases, we were allowed to phone them. We phoned them on hours where they did not work. Why? Because we wanted to hit their voicemail, because their voicemail was the pimp's voice and not the girl's voice. So we knew that
that's good. That's a good one.
That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, the same techniques also, not the same exact techniques, but the same kind of breadcrumb analysis is helping with the identification of a lot of different spies across Europe and Brazil. Nico, you were kind of bringing that up, and we've been going through a lot of different stories the last month or 2 months of just how many people are getting, you know, tagged that are, you know, Russian-based spies through open source intelligence and operational security issues. What are you guys seeing on that? You know what I mean? Like, that's pretty hot.
The amount of diplomats being expelled and people being caught, it's crazy. Well, it makes sense, right? The Ukraine war. But I think what I'm clearly noticing that there were now at least 3 incidents where alleged spies were caught, that they spent at least a decade or so in or around Brazil, basically trying to build their persona there. So clearly that is important to the way they operate. So that by itself is very interesting intelligence to me. But also just looking at how most of these spies that were caught so far are somewhat older, let's say above 40 and 45. So they were all, let's say, pre-internet spies, which means that they have online footprints because they were not aware as much of the risks of being exposed. So their OPSEC was pretty low. Recently, I worked on a case when I looked at 2 Swedish spies, and it was just out in the open. They posted it. The Swedish Post posted the location. So I had a picture of their home. All I needed to do was geolocate it. So now I know the street. Then I started looking for that street name and who maybe finding people who filed for something. So I found 2 businesses attached to that. I found other names. I found their social media just by one news article. One news article, a starting point, and then just critical thinking and pivoting. And you could basically find 15 to 20 years of them being sloppy online. That's it.
Yeah, I can correlate that as well. Like the age range, almost anybody above 35 has a good, you know, breadcrumb trail on the internet. You know, is that going to be totally exploitable, or not, but I've seen the same thing and done some really good attribution on folks that where I'm like, wow, like you guys look like super spies.
Yeah.
And it's just
Yeah, and it doesn't mean
you
that
know.
this is only the Russians that are, let's say, making those
No,
floppy
this
mistakes.
is all.
It's any spy agency
I say
around the
all
world.
of those spook folks. They all kind of have the same problem. If they're above the age of 35, hey, you probably need a better
Yeah.
assessment program, whatever that is.
Nowadays, the spies of the future are kids today playing Minecraft and Roblox. So I think
Yeah.
the trail is going to get even harder to cover, even if you want to.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
What frustrates me is when someone's like, "Hey, there's a 75-year-old cartel guy. We want you to help find him." I'm like, that's a lot harder than the
Yeah.
sort of 30,
So
40-year-old.
35 to like 65 is the golden area.
Yeah. Now, I think the interesting part now is with all the spies being caught, it clearly means that all the countries were already watching, in this case, the Russians, so they already knew it, but in some cases, they have let it go for decades because it makes sense, right? If you're going to expel someone, you no longer have sight on them. You no longer have eyes and ears on them. So you could better, in some cases, you can just better let it exist in a controlled situation.
Yeah.
Because now you know, and that basically, when you I'm looking at a document now that I'm keeping track of. So the last year by itself only, I've got more than 100 expelled diplomats, quote unquote, and I've got 2, 4, 6, 20, 36 people being arrested for spying all over the world. So from US to Slovakia to Poland to Belgium to the Netherlands to Germany, Norway, Sweden, it's everywhere. So it means that people clearly already knew about that.
That's a
But
good
now
point.
they're just exposing them. And that's also funny because when you look at this, normally there's no need to expose those spies, their names to the press. But that's also again part of that warfare game that we were talking about earlier. They will not only expose their persona name, but they will also expose their official passport name.
Right.
So with
and
that,
their picture. So and now
Yeah, so-
that everyone's got biometrics everywhere, okay, dude, it's not
Yeah.
just they're not just banned from that country, they're banned from operating. Go back home. Do
Yeah.
not collect $200, right?
Yeah, and for me and for let's say OSINT enthusiasts all around the world, it's like every time when I see an article, I'm like, hold my beer, let me fire.
Yeah,
off my
me too,
laptop.
right?
just
It's awesome.
it's so much for me. It's also so much fun just to see how much I can find based upon someone from which you now know that they try to hide for decades because that's what they do. They hide and they collect information, and I'm like, now let me see what I can find. Just
Right click, boom.
Maybe we need an achievement, like an Xbox Live achievement system for you, Nico, and all the spy hunters out there. Oh, you unlocked an achievement. 10 spies moms found. Or whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
But that by itself is also a little bit disturbing because people choose to be. That's a good comment. People make a decision to become a spy for a government or for their government, but
Yeah.
they also have families that may have nothing to do what dad or mom does. they are just part of that family, and now the situation that their mom or dad is can be really disturbing and could really, let's say, get them into trouble as well. And that's something that they did not ask for. So yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting.
That's a good point. Yeah.
We're definitely in the golden age of open source intelligence and illuminating these things, especially with our tools and the training that we have. We've got a huge bench. Nico's on it now too. So hey, sign up for training.
Yeah.
Tell them that you want the special training class that we don't have on the website because nobody wanted to do a 5-day class. So one of the funny things this last week, shifting out of that topic, is over to the the Chinese spy balloon that has been going on the last week and a half, 2 weeks or whatever. Elliott, what do you got on different tools that people can use, what they can play around with just for fun, you know,
We
that they can spin up in their house while they watch Jeopardy or whatever. You know?
oh no, flight aware and flight radar. You can pretty much see any plane that's up there in the sky. And we were watching these planes just circle that thing for, oh gosh, I don't know, 3 days or something like that.
3 or 4 days. Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, we know they knew exactly what the equipment was on that because they were right next to it a bunch. And two, it was pretty obvious that no one could hide from doing that. And when they went to shoot it down, they shut down the airspace directly over that area. So they're like, okay, they're about to shoot that thing down. But I'll tell you from a personal perspective, I was not to dive too far into politics, but I was not real excited about the idea of people just launching weather balloons over each other's countries and not setting a precedence of shooting them down. Cause I kind of feel like that's reasonable, like that seems like if you want to fly it over for some kind of research project, tell them, hey, we're going to fly this thing over. We're going to, study clouds or whatever. And, but I was surprised that it took them that long to finally do that, but we were able to see what was going on and historically what was going on. They obviously knew it was there before it really was heavily public. You could see planes flying around near it. In some research too, before it hit Reddit and stuff like that, I noticed there was some amateur photographers just using lenses on their DSLRs and telescopes to spot it. There was some people that spotted it pretty far west and went, what is this? Kind of thing. So Nico, you mentioned there's some tech you can use to track weather balloons that people were spinning up. I'm not super familiar with, but
yeah, so you can buy an RTL SDR. So basically, it's a USB stick that you pop into your laptop, and as long as your antenna is in range of a device. So the bigger your antenna or the more specific your antenna is, you can pick up anything. So I run this on a Raspberry Pi in my home just as a side hobby, just to track all the planes within. In my antenna can take, I think, around a radius of 500 kilometers. So and that's an antenna that's like 15 centimeters high. So that's
Elliott, so is that the radio transponder on there? Is that
I've got one of these. I'll give it to you, man. If you wanna spin it up on your rig,
sure. Well, I got a big antenna on my roof.
I know. You just plug it right into your computer. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And you can even then, if you share your basically your tracked information, some databases like ADSB Exchange will also give you for free then access to their overall global coverage database. But it's not only for planes. You can also do the same stuff for boats, the AIS tracking, weather balloons. You can even use those little RTL SDRs to tap into radio waves, so find number stations and basically it's signals intelligence in essence. It's not, it's still an open source.
You're talking to a guy that's done most of the OSINT work on his computer. So this is all fascinating to me.
So that's for me, it's like you buy those little antennas for like $60 on Amazon, and all you need to do is find some YouTube tutorial somewhere, and they will tell you how to set it up. It's like 15 minutes worth of work, and then you can start collecting that data. It's fun and interesting.
And then the SDRs are so fast now, like the Hack RF that came out like 5 or 6 years ago. That was awesome, but now there's like so many of these on the market. They're just so fast on scanning and picking stuff up. It's pretty cool, Yeah.
You would be amazed about the amount of aircraft of any sort that will be flying around your home that you had no idea of. So, and just like you said, sometimes seeing those interesting patterns where planes fly like in very specific square boxes or circles where you're like, now let me look at Google Maps and see what's on the ground there. Maybe there's an interesting, military base or nuclear plant or power plant. And why is this little Cessna flying over all these vicinities in, let's say, 2 weeks' time in a certain area? That by itself is interesting.
Or it's like in Miami, just like tracking this super, super drug dealer guy. This is his house. This is where he goes.
Yeah. It's fun stuff.
Yeah, I pull up FlightAware a lot just on my phone, just when I'm out in the country and I see something up in the sky and go, okay, who is that? Most of the time it's American Airlines. So
Yeah.
it's like,
But I think the funny thing is with if you have your own antenna, you can also see the planes that are not so non-commercial, so military, that kind of stuff. And of course they can jam it or turn it off. But on average, I can see Reaper drones. I can see anything with my little antenna. It's
yeah.
super fun.
Well, then there's the trade-off of if you're flying around without that thing turned on and there's a plane up there that doesn't have radar, I mean, that's dangerous. So I would think
Yep.
most those groups are going to keep that stuff on. So
you would be amazed, for example, when we talk about ships, Iranian ships and Chinese ships that spoof their AAS somewhere to be in the middle of a city just to not let you know. But again, just like you said, people are watching everywhere. So you have boat spotters, plane spotters, car spotters all around the world. So even when people obfuscate those radio signals, we still have eyes and ears everywhere. This is why I love OSINT, man. There's so much information.
yeah, I saw Tiny Bunny Trail. I saw a technology last week that, cars are so that they're pretty much the same unless it's custom built. Man, the algorithms to read what type of car is in a picture in the year model is incredibly accurate. Like we're talking like 99%. If it can see something like 25% of the body of a vehicle, it's like it can tell you the year, make, model, and even submodels and stuff. And that's, you apply that technology to a bunch of video data that you have, and you got yourself you could totally target anyone. I drive a sports car. It's black and it's got orange stripes on it. Everywhere I go, people, I saw you over you over here at the store. If I drive a white Civic, I'm invisible,
Yeah.
And so it's that concept, but applied, on a global scale to, boats and planes and stuff. Boats is an area, boats and those types of things are something I really don't have a lot of experience in. I haven't gotten to work in that space very much, but there's a boat one that's just like FlightAware. I've used it a bunch. I forget the name of it, but
Marine traffic.
Marine traffic. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That's pretty interesting, but that's it's interesting that someone would spoof the signal in a city. That's very interesting. So
it was so funny when we had in 2014, we had the Nuclear Science Summit over here in the Netherlands. So all the world leaders came over here and my team was doing OSINT. I was in law enforcement. And in the week before, we saw all kinds of Russian fishing ships
wow.
sailing our waters. And not only Russian ones, but and when you look up those pictures, you'll see fishermen ships with like 25 antennas, like that's not odd. But
right.
by itself is super interesting because now I know and I can simply track him all over the world.
Yeah, it's the undercover Vice unit with the blacked out tent and 6 antennas on his Crown Victoria. You're like, that's totally not a cop. There's no way. Yeah.
But this is interesting. For example, if you now go to that Davos event recently, that World Economic Forum event, those are locations where you should start monitoring for ships and planes and let's say certain patterns. It's super fun to do.
Yeah,
but now
that's smart.
When we started off before we hit the recording button, I was talking then. I simply need to hack more hours in a day. I need more hours in it. That's my biggest problem.
Yeah, I one of the things I do is if a kid's missing locally, I'll usually spend a few minutes. There's something that feels really good about getting that kill, figuring out what's going on. That's always it's a rush for sure. It's addictive. Definitely. I can't, you hear people say what is it? You do what you love and you'll never like hate your job or whatever. And that's a fun part of it. It's cool.
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that I really like about OSINT and investigations is the data is telling me the story. And, like as you're going through the investigation or the puzzle or whatever you want to call it, there's always this anxiety or mystery of, what is the real truth here or what's behind this? And, letting the data tell the story as a seasoned investigator really, really kind of lowers that anxiety level and also lets you just kind of be at peace with what the conclusion is, whatever the thing is that we're hunting. And I try to tell that to any of the folks that go through our training all the time, like, hey, you know, you're going to feel super anxious in your investigation by the third day. Go out and do something else. Go mow the lawn, drink a beer, drive your car fast with loud music, and, you know, let your subconscious solve the problem. But really, the cool win there is always the data telling the story, and you just kind of feeling that sense of rest, like, oh yeah, I've solved this problem, whatever the problem is.
Taking a step back, being aware of your bias, those are the keys to success.
Totally. Well, I think we're going to wrap up this podcast. We had a lot of good content here, and hopefully we're going to have some more folks on the next few podcasts, and some more topics. So
yeah, looking forward to it.
All right.
Looking forward to next time.
Thanks, guys.